Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. I'm your host Cheryl Hentz, and very pleased to welcome back to the show someone who's been here many, many times, and we hope that he will come back many, many more times in the future. It's Representative Gordon Hintz from the 54th Assembly District, and since you've last been on, you have a new title. You are the Assembly Minority Leader.
That's right. October 1st, I took over leading the Assembly Democrats in the state legislature, and it's been busy. It's been a new challenge. So to have two constituencies, I still get up and serve the people of Oshkosh every day, but I kind of am herding cats a little bit. There's been analogies to condo association or a middle school cafeteria, but it's interesting and it's been enjoyable, but it's been pretty busy.
Sure. Well, congratulations on that. It's a status that comes with a lot of responsibility, of course. So. Yeah,
I mean, obviously, you're one of the voices for the Democrats. The state is diverse, and our Democratic Party is diverse: urban, rural, Madison, Milwaukee, manufacturing, agriculture, and it's allowed me the opportunity, certainly, to visit more of these places and learn more about Wisconsin. But a lot of my job is to work with the speaker as well, sort of how things are going to work, the rules of engagement, the rules of disagreement, the priorities that we can try to get done. And so I try to use it to advocate and help steer and help the process go smoother for everyone.
Sure. Well, we got a lot of things that we need to cover tonight because as we're taping this on February 1st, was it last week or 2 weeks ago that Scott Walker gave his State of the State address? I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago now. But in any event, we want to cover a lot of the things that he talked about in that address. One of the things that he talked about was the fact that state property taxes are now gone away. And, I didn't look that closely at our tax bill this year, but I thought that there was a property tax line still on there. Is this something that's going to go away for future property taxes, or?
The effective date, actually, I'm going to have to go back and look at, but it was kind of this quirky thing. If you looked at your tax bill, school district, county, municipal levy, but then there was one line that said state forestry tax that we've had for 100 years that was aimed at dedicating revenue to help protect our state forests and the forest industry. Which is very important.
Sure.
And I think you can raise questions as to whether it was the appropriate revenue source to pay for these things. What happened, and I was on the budget committee, is they did eliminate the state property tax. Now that amount was not very much in terms of what it cost each person, but it was $180 million a year or something. While they got rid of the revenue, they never got rid of the expense. In other words, that just shifted on to other taxes, which will now compete for funding with schools and universities and prisons and Medicaid. And the question from a lot of people in the forestry industry is, all right, well, we had a dedicated revenue source that ensured that our forestry industry was going to have that investment. Can you commit to funding it going forward? And I think too often that these are the decisions that are being made where we highlight the cut in revenue, but we never do an offsetting cut to spending, and then it pits programs against each other, and we end up with something less than we thought.
So I want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying here, Gordon. So yes, the property taxes from the state of Wisconsin have been eliminated, but basically the things that those taxes were being paid by that property tax, those are now going to be, I guess they're going to cost more.
Paid for with sales tax,
they're
income
going to cost
tax.
more, right?
Well, or they're just going to be at risk of, it's off of your property taxes, and maybe you can make that case. But again, when you get rid of a revenue, you might want to get rid of some spending too, because you want those things to align. If we believe this is a program that's worth funding, then we should have the revenue to pay for it. I always saw it on there and said, well, why do we have a state property tax? And it really wasn't until we started hearing from a lot of people in the forestry industry making the case that, look, it's been part of our longstanding tradition to be able to count on this. It's an important industry in Wisconsin. So my fear isn't immediate, but it sounds better than it is from your financial savings standpoint.
Well, everything I think that a lot of politicians say sounds better than it really is when it comes down to black and white on paper. And, so it sounds like the things that were being paid for by the property tax are now just being shifted somewhere else, and those particular line items may go up as a result. And so that's really kind of being, well, it's not kind of being, it is being disingenuous. Yeah, sure, you've gotten rid of the property tax, but he needs to tell the other half of the story, and he's not.
That's right, and it'll just be someone else's problem in the future.
Sure. And while we're on that subject, for years, each community has gotten back money from the state to take care of some of our own expenses. And that shared revenue has disappeared and disappeared. It's been whittled down over the years to practically nothing. I mean, why couldn't, while he was doing this very benevolent thing, why didn't he give back some of the shared revenue to the municipalities and townships that he took it from?
To me, this is one of the big questions. Communities like Oshkosh, and we've certainly felt it, with levy limits and with cuts in state aid, it's been harder for us to do the types of things that we need to do as a community to enhance quality of life. We've got streets, we've got public safety, we've got parks, but if we're going to recruit young talent to live in communities like ours, you want them to have the flexibility to make enhance quality of life, to be innovative. If you look around the country, Washington is kind of in constant gridlock. Sometimes state government is
Washington,
in
D.C.
Washington, D.C.
Okay,
Sorry, state government sometimes overly partisan. But if you look around the country, the most innovative ideas, the most innovative problem solving is really happening at the local level. Mm-hmm. Even things beyond traditional services in sustainability, in multi-generational housing. I mean, they're taking entirely different tacks because they can get things done. Our communities here, we keep taking away local control. We pass state laws that say that you can't pass sick leave ordinances or other policies. Minimum wage was taken away years ago.
Yeah.
So if communities that had different interests and different goals to enhance their community, it just, and I think the starving of shared revenue has made it harder for our communities to do much more than the most important things, and I think it's hurt our competitiveness.
Sure. So do we have any chance at all ever of seeing shared revenue make a comeback, or do you think it's just gone for good?
Well, it's there. The problem is there's no policy behind it. The old policy used to try to, give some incentive for spending and saving, and you try to hit that sweet spot. It's just a pot of money, and like the school formula, it's kind of been on cruise control for a while. Right. There are trade-offs with changing it, and look, Democrats and Republicans have this isn't brand new on the shared revenue problem. It's competing with growing Medicaid, with growing corrections, with growing education. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that I want offsetting increased property taxes, but I do think this needs to be a bigger priority for the state, because I do believe that our communities need the resources necessary to be more vibrant, be more innovative. I mean, how many years in a row do we follow the city budget and their choices are, should we get rid of a fire truck, or should we, get rid of garbage service once a week?
Yeah, well, it really does make it difficult for cities and townships and, whatever, to really provide even the basic of core services when he just continues to whittle away at shared revenue and not give it back. And it does make communities have to make very tough choices.
And again, I think we could use some significant property tax reform, but just saying, no property tax increases and less state aid, and then trying to, eventually there's consequences in quality of service and value.
Well, so he was boasting about the schools. That was the next thing that was on my list here. Unemployment. Let's talk about unemployment first. He's very boastful about the fact that the unemployment rate in our state has dropped to 3%. And of course, that's a good thing.
Very
No one
good.
can really argue with that. It's almost the lowest it's ever been. He made reference to the fact that the most recent time that it was that low was in May, June, and July of 1999. So, I mean, we're going back a few decades here. And so that's a good thing. But is there another side to that story?
There is another side of the
let's hear it.
story. So, look, the national economy is in the third longest period of growth in U.S. history. I mean, since like 2009. If we make it through June of 2019, it'll be the longest period of sustained economic growth in U.S. history. Now, Wisconsin's economy has grown at a little more than half the national average. So we've been slower, but it's been growing. And what that means is every year we've had more money due to the growth. Our challenge in Wisconsin is we don't have enough people. So we have low unemployment, but slow economic growth. And so as an indicator, it's not necessarily a sign of a healthy economy, especially when you see that we can't fill jobs, and we haven't really seen the wages increase that you would expect if there was the labor shortage. So Wisconsin's always had lower unemployment than the nation. We've always had higher labor participation rate, but we have an aging population. We're the 15th oldest in the country. We don't have a big immigrant population, legal or undocumented, and we have real challenges. So we're reflective of the national economy. I think there's 11 states that have below 3%. It's a good thing, but it's part of this national economic picture. But our job growth, the fact that we've lost some people in that 24 to 55-year-old working age range since 2011, I think is sort of more telling. The question is, what have we done with the prosperity nationally of the last 8 years? And that can forward to your school question, because when you think about the fact that we've had more resources every year during this economic expansion, yet we have cut funding for the UW system, yet we cut funding for K-12 education until this last budget, raises real questions of, have we blown governing during this period of modest growth?
Yeah, well, he talks about, for the schools, he's boasting of the fact that the schools have some of the highest ACT scores and some of the best graduation rates in the country. Now, he says that he's invested more actual dollars into K-12 education than ever before. An extra $200 for every student in every school in every part of the state this year, and another $204 increase for every student on top of that next year. So it's sort of a cumulative thing, one on top of another. But it's things are never as good as they sound, Gordon. They're just not.
They're not.
And I look at him and I just have a tough time believing anything that this man says. It's kind of like our president. You have to pick and choose what you believe if you choose to believe any of it. And, some of the things that he's done, unemployment rate, okay, well, how much of that is attributed to him? Maybe a small portion. But this business of $200 for every student in every school in every part of the state this year and another $204 next year, where is that money coming from?
Sure. If K-12 education was just for 2 years, if you put your kid in school and they were there for 2 years, I would feel more comfortable about things. But the reality is, in 2011, we had the largest cuts to K-12 education in state history. And then in the other years, we actually poured money into property tax relief. Some money made it into the classroom. But remember, Oshkosh and 140 other school districts in the state went to referendum because they didn't have enough state aid.
Right.
So people voted to tax themselves to make up more than $630 million in aid cuts. So after 3 straight 2-year budgets, the governor last year put money back into schools. The budget before the election, and while it was a big increase, we're still spending below what we did 10 years ago as a state when you consider inflation. So, he's using some cherry picking and I'm using the inflationary measurement, but I think it's something that's important because when you look at the challenges that are facing districts, especially rural districts, with the lack of teachers available, if you look at what districts like Oshkosh are dealing with in terms of historically being low spending in the formula, and I'm hoping that we'll fix that. We still face a lot of challenges. So I was happy to see more money in the budget for education. It's certainly going to be good for schools, but K-12 education requires 13 years of investment. And
Right.
historically, Republicans and Democrats in Wisconsin, that was always a big priority. We paid for it, but I remember friends moving away, having kids, and saying, we're going to move back to Wisconsin because of the schools. And I don't know that is quite the same, but it's one of these things that it takes time to build up and it doesn't fall apart overnight. And the question going forward is, are we going to be able to maintain that level of investment?
Sure. So the other half of this story is that he's basically giving back
That's
2
right.
years in a row some of what he took away.
That's right.
It's not equaling what he took away. It's, yeah.
And you want it to be 13 years, not 2 years.
Right, right. Okay, so let's talk about the criminal justice system. You got Lincoln Hills, which is a big issue right now. You've got the state prison system in Green Bay, which is in a horrible state. Horrible state being conditioned, not horrible state of Wisconsin. Let's clarify that. He's pushing for a major reform of the criminal justice system for juvenile offenders, and that would be the Lincoln Hills thing. But what I find interesting is he's looking at best practices that places like Missouri are doing. Why do when we have seen comparison after comparison between Wisconsin and Minnesota, and how Minnesota exceeds and surpasses us in every single area. I don't care what area of governing you want to look at, they've got it right. They've got it right, and they're doing it the right way. Why does this governor insist on looking elsewhere? Why doesn't he look to them, Gordon?
Well, there's a couple different things here. The governor was uninterested in any kind of corrections reform until he had an issue that wouldn't go away. They closed Ethan Allen, the juvenile center down by Milwaukee. They concentrated the kids up at Lincoln Hills. Act 10 happened. A lot of the most experienced staff retired. They started having problems. You had a criminal investigation, issues of abuse, issues of staff being overworked, and never visited. I went to visit in November. Said everything's fine in November, but the issue didn't go away. There might be criminal charges. All of a sudden, the governor's up for re-election. He's like, we got to do something about Lincoln Hills. So he takes a proposal that another colleague had. The other challenge is that a lot of other states with conservative governors have been able to do reforms because they realize we're spending all this money. Our states aren't any safer. 95% of the people in prison are going to get released at some point. And they started doing some of the things that we've done here with diversion programs, drug courts, safe streets, getting treatment, spending money on some of those resources. In Kansas, they did it. Rick Perry in Texas did it, and they lowered their prison populations. Governor Walker was the author of Truth in Sentencing. In other words, where you do the crime, you do the time, no discretion, no incentive for good behavior on the inside. And so we had one of the first things he did as governor was repealed what we'd passed in 2009 of doing earned release for nonviolent offenders to be able to better themselves for making it on the outside, getting their degree, good behavior. And so he's been reluctant to do a lot of these things. And meanwhile, if you talk to the people who are working on the front lines, they're understaffed. They're working in conditions where they're forced to work 16 hours. They go home for 8 hours. They come back and they're forced to work 16 hours again.
Right.
Like I wish, if everybody, same at Winnebago Mental Health, and it doesn't get enough attention. We as a state ask people to keep us safe. We lock them up, or we help people that need assistance, committed to Winnebago.
Yeah.
That's what we're saying we're going to do. But the people that have to work there are being forced and of course at Lincoln Hills that was part of the problem. You're working 16 hours, you go home, you sleep for 5 hours, and you come back and you're dealing with some really troubled kids.
Yep.
It's a situation where you want to protect the safety of the worker and you want to protect the safety of the kid with issues.
You
and
have to be alert. You have to have your not just your wits about you, but your senses about
That's
you.
right.
And if you're that tired, you can't possibly be as well equipped to handle a situation as if you were just coming on the job after a great maybe 8 to 10 hours worth of sleep.
That's right. And
You
so
know?
you had this combustible situation, and that's essentially what happened. We lost the staff that was the most experienced. We had a shortage of staff, people that weren't, that versed in dealing with some of the populations that hadn't traditionally been in northern Wisconsin. And we had no action for 6 years. Now in an election year, we're getting attention on it. I hope we do something, even if it's for political purposes. But we've missed an opportunity to do what a lot of other states have done that would have saved taxpayer dollars, would have enhanced public safety, and would have improved the chances that people that serve time would stay out of prison once they got out.
Well, I know that it's the juvenile system that's getting a lot of attention right now because of Lincoln Hills, but clearly, I mean, Green Bay something has got to be done with that facility. Officers and maybe even their supervisors are getting very hurt. I think that people have the idea that because these inmates are locked up, that it's a relatively safe job. Is it as dangerous as being out on the road? Probably not, especially when you've got concealed carry and this kind of thing, and that's another whole topic for discussion. But nonetheless, it is dangerous because, all someone has to do is take a tour of a jail. And I think they'd have a better appreciation for what these folks, whether it's a local jail or a state prison facility, go through on a day-to-day basis. They don't know from one day to the next if when they kiss their loved ones goodbye in the morning and go off to work, if they'll be coming home that night. It's that dangerous.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that has really changed is when you talk to corrections officers is they'll tell you that the inmates know what's happening on the outside. They know that they're short-staffed or they're working forced overtime. They knew about Act 10 and what was being done to them, and so it made this situation even more antagonistic. But Oshkosh used to be correctional institute. People would work around the state and say, I want to make it to Oshkosh. I mean, someone told me it took them 12 years to be able to work on first shift at Oshkosh because it was a professional place, it was well run, it was safe, the workers had direct investment in how things work. Now you go through the academy, you can get on first shift, and so you've got brand new people, someone that are getting trained by someone who's been there for 4 months, and I think if you talk to some of the older officers, they'll say to you something's bad's going to happen, and we've had incidents, we've had increased cases of assault of workers,
Yep.
and we owe it. It's hard because either you need to increase pay progression, restore some bargaining rights, but we can't expect people to work on the front lines in these positions, without treating them better because they're putting it on the line and they deserve better.
Has Governor Walker toured a state prison?
No, and it's one of the things that I think, how can you have one of the top 4 or 5 biggest expenses in the state of Wisconsin? We pass laws, that increase penalties. I think it's something that you should do during your time as governor, just like you would schools, just like you work at universities.
Yep.
The staff at Lincoln Hills, which they feel the negativity, all the press coverage, everything else. They were all dedicated public servants who were honest about. We talked to staff, we talked to inmates, we talked to administrators. They talked about what they were trying to do, but a lot of it came down to we don't have enough people here to be able to effectively keep the kids safe and ourselves safe. And that's and this is the big challenge. And again, with the labor shortage going on, the timing of Act 10 was terrible because of the exodus and the retirements. But now we're just in a position where, like private sector, we're having a shortage of people, but now it's increasing the threat to safety for a lot of these men and women.
Sure. So a couple of things. We've mentioned Act 10 a few times. If someone's watching this and say they're new to the area, or maybe they're watching this on YouTube and they're in another state, tell briefly what Act 10 is and what it does. Or
Well,
did.
so one of the governor's first things, he said during the election in 2010 that he was going to sit down and bargain with public workers. Wisconsin had longstanding belief in collective bargaining process for public employees, which meant that they would sit down and work out labor practices, pay issues, other things. Part of that was to kind of keep the peace. And, part of the decision to do this was to dismantle the political strength of organized labor around the state. The teachers' union was long seen as supporting Democrats and the big business being supportive of Republicans. The governor said we need to do it to save money. We're going to get rid of collective bargaining and make people pay more for health insurance and pension. And if it had been financial, you could have just done those things.
Sure.
What ultimately happened, though, was right before this labor shortage was going to happen, you had people retire way earlier than they would have originally. You have fewer people getting into the teaching profession.
Yep.
You have people not getting into corrections. So if you're someone who supported it, you were like, these people shouldn't be making this much. It's expensive. I don't like unions. And that's fine. That might be your opinion. But the consequences are we now have a shortage. We don't have enough people. People aren't going into education programs. For a while, the Oshkosh School District would hire a new teacher, would train them, would certify them, and they would go leave 3 years after we invested all that in them because they could get paid more, where before there would have been some benefit because of seniority, because of progression, and the district could have actually cultivated a plan. Now, if you talk to principals, they'll say, we have different teachers year to year. So it was something that wasn't that well thought out. It had a lot more to do with politics than it did to policy. There would have been ways that you could have done cost containment. There were ways that you could have done some of the financial things, but still let them have the right to, if you talk to correction officers, they'll say, we don't have the right to say what happens when there's a collapsed post, or what happens in situations with staffing levels, or whether we can have to administer prescription drugs or things that they used to be able to say, we don't want this, or it had to be a relationship that put them as equals. So not only are there not enough people, not only is the pay not keeping up with inflation, but their work conditions have changed because they feel like management's got too much power and it's easy for them to crack down.
Sure. And, so how do we, if we can't undo or dismantle Act 10, how do we go about filling these positions, whether it's in corrections or in education? Because this is still, by and large, a good place to live in the state of Wisconsin. We do have a lot going for us. So how do we correct these things that have been a direct result of Act 10?
This is the hardest thing, especially with men and women that work at Winnebago and at the Resource Center and at Oshkosh, because I'm tired of having the same conversations because they'll call when things get bad, when overtime is really big, and then I'll call Tom's speech at Winnebago, and I'll say what's happening, and then I'll call DHS, and I said, look, you can't do this to people. We hire new people, they get $13 an hour, and they want to do the job because they care, but they're getting punched, kicked, whatever, but then they start missing their kids' graduation, or they have to work the weekend when they weren't planning on it because of forced overtime, and then they quit. And then we have to pay to hire a new group of people in the cycle. So I think if we're going to say as a state that it's our obligation to take care of people that have committed crimes and keep them in prison, we're going to have to pay for it. If we think there are more cost-effective ways to deal with criminal justice, that's another reason to consider it. The fact that the Republicans were talking about building a new prison, even at a time when our population growth is pretty flat, when we have more retirees and where crime has gone down, I think spoke to the fact that we're not being very creative or fiscally responsible with how we plan things. But it's hard, because Yeah, you'll say, well, should we invest in our schools or should we invest in paying corrections more? Well, the reality is we don't have enough people there now. If the market's going to work, we have to. It used to be a better career. I mean, when you talk to people here, you'd start out and somebody that had been there a while say, look, if you work hard, if you can tolerate these conditions, you can have a good life. Your job is recession proof. You'll be able to afford a house. You can retire earlier. There's good pension. Quality of life in Wisconsin's high. Now what happens is a new person starts, guy that's been there says, get out of here. There's not a career for you.
Yeah.
You're going to be making $1.50 more 5 years from now than you make now, and the conditions are only getting worse.
It's become a revolving door.
It
really.
is. I mean, and that's what you'll hear. And so it's again, it's going to be a big issue until something bad happens, and it's got to be a bigger priority. And we raised this in the budget. But it's tough.
Is there any legislation that, I know that the political season here, if you will, the term is coming to a little bit of a close here, but is there any legislation that is pending or maybe pending when you guys come back into session that will help solve some of these problems?
Well, I mean, there's been some bills introduced that would aim to try to limit the overtime, but they're in a position where if they don't have people, there's not an option, and the reason they do it is because there has to be staffing there. Right. Most of the discussions on what to do took place in the budget, and it's really going to take sort of a big picture, how do we do the next 20 years? Because the labor problem is not going away, right. And the state has a lot of things competing for the money, but it's... Again, I've got friends who just shake their head when they see me and think, it's bad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I hear it too. You said that he hasn't toured a state prison. Has he been to Lincoln Hills? I think he has, hasn't he? Or no, he has not.
And I'll say that is one that changed a lot of things for me. After reading about it, after not being completely aware of what happened, going up there, visiting, talk to some of the kids, the staff, the administration, and then especially hearing about the labor shortage, I think really put things into perspective, and I think it would be helpful for the governor as well.
So what his plan is he wants to create, now is it 5 or 6? I've heard different numbers on this, but whether it's 5 or 6, it doesn't really matter, I guess, a whole lot. But he wants to create more smaller units in different places as opposed to having this one large facility that we know as Lincoln Hills. When I first heard that, because it's a lot of money, it's a lot of, many millions of dollars. I don't know if, isn't it like $80-some million or something like that?
I think part of this was probably written on a napkin and again lifted from one of my colleagues who's done a lot of work on this, Gary Goyke, former senator's son, who's in the legislature, proposal. So one of the things, we have kids from all over the state. Mm-hmm. I deal with Bill Topol with Human Services at the county level, and he's really helped me understand from the county's perspective why they don't want to have kids get referred to Lincoln Hills. It costs money, they don't get good outcomes when they return. Part of the success is smaller, not 200 kids, but dealing with 30 kids, having the intervention of not just educators, but mental health counselors and security. The other thing is keeping the kids closer to home. So when they closed Ethan Allen, you have all these kids from Milwaukee and Racine and Kenosha. All of a sudden, they're 4.5 hours away. Obviously, there are cultural differences. They're away from their families, and they're in these big groups where, even at Lincoln Hills, they said, well, we're trying to separate kids in terms of their behavioral disorders, and they're trying to do the small group things. But I think what had worked in Missouri and what they had done a while ago with pretty good results was keeping them closer to home, having a staff ratio that was reasonable, and the percentage of kids that got out that didn't reoffend later was a much higher success than Wisconsin.
Well, and all of that makes sense. I know when I first heard Walker's proposal, I just thought, what? If we're going to take $80-some million and invest it into building smaller facilities in different places, why don't we just use that money to fix the facility that we currently have? And then somebody was explaining this to me, and I'm not I don't remember offhand who it was, but they essentially said the same thing as you just did, Gordon. And then it kind of made sense to me. I thought, oh,
I mean, it's
okay,
actually a
this
pretty good
is-
idea.
Yeah.
I just think that it's a little disingenuous the governor first got contacted about the problem at Lincoln Hills in 2011 by the head of Human Services or by a judge in Racine County. They quit sending kids there then. Governor says he never received the letter. And then when the press did the Journal Sentinel deserves a lot of credit for doing the investigation, the piece, and then the Attorney General's got involved, and then the FBI got involved. And then even as recently as November, he said he's comfortable with how things are there. He didn't see any things to change. Well, then Ed Wall, the former corrections secretary, says, I'm writing a tell-all book about how Governor Walker failed, and it's coming out the summer before the election. And the governor's like, I got it. We got a plan. We're going to take Evan Goike's plan, and it's going to be great. I mean, so I support juvenile justice reform. It's completely transparent that it was political. He's had no interest in this for 6 years. But it's not something you want to do hastily with a month left to session.
Right.
We should be doing these things carefully, thinking about our long term. And I take your point seriously. We should do juvenile justice, but we should think about our whole correction system, not just today, but what it looks like in 15 years. And we should look at some other models, including Minnesota.
Sure. Well, he wants to reform some aspects of public assistance too, and one of the things that he wants to do is if anyone, it doesn't matter who they are, if they're receiving public assistance, he feels that they should be drug tested. And Dave Hansen from up in Green Bay, he says, no, that's sort of picking on poor people. You're singling them out by having them do this. What's his logic behind this? I'm sure it has to do with, okay, if you're on drugs, you're not going to be able to find work. So if you're off drugs, then you'll be able to find work. But the reality, Gordon, is that the kind of jobs that are available out there, A, they're either not the kind of jobs that these people can do, or they're not providing a living wage. So what's his rationale?
Well, it's been quite a 6 weeks for this governor, but there was an open records request done of the emails related to this proposal, and it actually had to do with the fact that in western Wisconsin, the Republican candidate for that open Senate seat was going to lose. There was an 18-point swing between the 2016 election and what the new Senator Patty Schachner got in the Senate district over there. The governor knows that nothing plays to the base more than beating up on poor people that are down on their luck, not unlike some of the things we heard in the State of the Union address. So here we are. We hadn't heard of any of these proposals. Governor flies around the state in a plane lecturing people who are living on the margins about why they will have to do more. I mean, if you're serious about helping people that are on assistance, that are in public housing, get off there, there's a pretty clear path to do that. It takes some investment, it takes some support, it takes some assistance with employers to help them get there. But we know that this is an inefficient use of money, it's expensive, and it's unaccountable. I mean, other states that have done the drug testing have demonstrated that it is expensive and that a lower percentage of that population uses drugs that test positive than other groups. This is another one that's just political. There's no real meaningful policy behind it other than getting some sound head bites that, look, I kicked a bunch of people off food stamps.
Yeah. Do you think that there's enough support to pass something like that?
This is another one that's moving pretty fast. And look, I'm open to each consideration and seeing if, I want to get people off assistance as well. I want to get them into the workforce because we need it. But I think you need some carrots in there, not just these sticks that seem to be not, it seems like that he's more than happy to kick them off and let them fend for themselves. And I think that's short-sighted.
Sure. Well, let's talk about Foxconn because he certainly is talking about it enough. So we may as well be part of that group and talk about the Foxconn deal. Now, this has the potential, and I say potential because nothing really too much that Foxconn has promised other states has really come to fruition. If all of this happens the way he tells us it's going to happen, there will be 13,000 new jobs, but they're all going to be in the southern part of the state. People from the North Woods or even Northeast Wisconsin, North Central Wisconsin, the western part of the state, they're not going to travel down there for a job. So that is not going to help people up here. In addition to which, he's giving them so many tax credits and incentives to build this. And the people who are also going to be benefiting from this are the people in Illinois. And yet they're not kicking in one dime for this whole thing. And that's kind of unfair too. And as I said, Foxconn has not met their promises in a lot of other cases. So, I mean, talk to me about what
in
this is
3
all
words,
about,
I would
really.
just say it's risky, it's really expensive, and it's unaccountable. I think when the news was announced that Wisconsin was going to get Foxconn, I was like, oh, they picked us, that's great. When I saw the deal, I said, that's not great. We're putting all of our eggs in one basket. And you're absolutely right about maybe someone down in Racine can make a case that, well, it's all coming here. But the fact that we're spending up to $4.5 billion of public support for Foxconn is going to come out of your K-12 education budget. It's going to come out of the university system. It's going to come out of corrections. And what are we going to, if I told you in 1988 that we were going to build a VCR factory in Racine County, Wisconsin, and we're going to have it paid for in 25 years, would that have been a good deal? Or what if I built a BlackBerry factory in 2005? I mean, does anybody have any idea what the LCD screen environment in the economy is going to be like in 5 years or 10 years? So the one thing I always have to mention to people is they don't pay taxes. So the tax credits that they get, if they have to invest $10 billion of capital and they have to hire all 13,000 to get all of the credit, but it comes in the form of cash payments. Yeah. So not only are they getting all of this assistance, they're not paying taxes. It's coming in the form of cash payments. It's not a credit. And I think that's one of the hardest parts. And it's the opportunity costs. If people just focus on the jobs, they're like, well, why would you be against jobs? It's like, well, think about all the small businesses. Think about if we could have met with Kimberly-Clark or Appleton Coated and said, for a fraction of that, is there a way to modernize things? Are you sure you don't want to make your long-term investment here? I mean, when I talk to small businesses in Oshkosh, they say, look, they don't care about us. One small businessman said, during the recession, we cut our hours to 35 a week so we could keep everybody because we knew we were going to need them. You think Foxconn is going to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not going to invest in the local community. And so the environmental issues, and the problem is the legislation's passed, the contract's been signed, and the best case scenario is that it pays for itself by 2043. The worst case scenario, it's much longer. And then we have I can't stop because there's so much to talk about. They're taking $134 million away from state highway projects around the state to fix local roads around Foxconn. So when your state project doesn't get done, it's because you're paying it to Foxconn, and it's like the gift that just keeps on taking, not giving.
Well, I didn't know that that amount of money was being taken away from roads, and yet, you look at some of the road work that's being done along Highway 41, or I-41 as it's now called. This project never ends, and obviously there's money for that coming from someplace, I don't know where, because he has said in the past that there wasn't enough money to take care of all the roads. Then all of a sudden we had an excess of money in our roads account, if you will. To me, Gordon, this just seems like a major shell game, and maybe that's what all government is when you get
Don't
past
get cynical.
when you get past local government. But I mean, really, that's what it seems to be with this governor. Is a shell game. Move it from one place to another. It doesn't matter as long as we have money to do it. We don't care where we're taking it from.
I mean, I think the lack of accountability is something that's consistent on a lot of issues. The biggest failure, probably for the governor during his time, has been the failure to do anything about transportation. It's true that, you ask how we paid for it. We've paid for it by borrowing money. So when he started, about 10 or 11 cents of every dollar that we spent on transportation went to pay off debt. And you're going to borrow money just like a mortgage. Now we spend over 20 cents in every dollar that we spend on transportation is going to pay off debt. So now he doesn't want to borrow anymore, so we're cutting projects. And when you delay projects, you do more patches. We now have the second worst roads in the United States. And that's something like our education system. You can't fix it overnight, but it doesn't fall apart overnight. And I think that's one of the important things. We make things here in Northeast Wisconsin, and it's important for our goods and services to get through Milwaukee to Chicago to market. The 441, it was delayed, and then it got brought back to its original schedule, and the governor said it's going to be done early, even though it's just being done at an original date now. Look, at some point you have to look at how we're going to pay for roads instead of just borrowing. People are driving less, fuel efficiency's gone up, so our revenues are stagnant. Some of our infrastructure is 50, 60 years old. I mean, it's time, and part of your job as governor is to lead, is to make tough decisions, even if that means looking at a fee or a tax. But just simply delaying projects and borrowing money has not been a good policy, and the next governor is going to have a big mess to inherit.
Well, yeah, and just like our president, there was a lot of stuff that Obama inherited and had to try and fix. And so I don't know. But, I want to talk about the Foxconn jobs, because when Walker was first running for office, he promised that in his first term he would create 250,000 new jobs. Now what year are we in here? Seven? Yep. So he's still, even if you add in the 13,000 jobs that Foxconn may create, he still wouldn't have met that $250,000 goal. And I don't know where he thinks he's creating these, but he still touts the fact that, he's creating all these jobs all over the place.
And look, a lot of things, and I think that's been part of the problem, is the governor was so desperate to try to get to that jobs number, or to demonstrate that he's been remotely successful on economic development, that he got taken advantage of. I mean, what happens when you get a desperate governor and an opportunistic billionaire investor who needs to get a favorable trade deal from the federal government? What you get is Foxconn. We're going to give away the farm. Governor's going to say, look, jobs, Foxconn's here. Except I think he underestimated the fact that, the polling on this is terrible, especially outstate. And people know about it. That's the one thing we've seen, is people are like, why am I giving money, paying money to a company for something that I don't know if it's going to be there in 10 or 15 years? It's a really bad decision that's short-sighted.
Are they being given the incentives kind of as they go, so that they're not being given everything all up front, and then they're not going to do anything, the project stops, and they take the money and run?
So $2.85 billion of it is for both the up to the 13,000 jobs and up to the $10 billion investment. It's actually designed in a way to do it, over 15 years. And I don't think they're going to hit those targets. The question is, if they can't find anybody to work there, because the question I asked is, the median wage is about 43 grand, and I'm like, is 43 grand enough to get people to move all over the country to Racine?
Yeah.
And if it's not, are they going to raise pay, or are they just going to add another robot? So if they invest the $10 billion to automate this facility, they'll get all of the $1.5 billion, but they don't end up hiring more than 3,000 people. We will, and then they close in 10 or 15 years. We will have lost at least half of that $3 billion. So I think there's real questions of what happens if they spend it all on the capital, but they don't get the employment targets.
Well, and you talk about the employment targets. What kind of training do these folks, will they need to be able to work there? Because I don't know that we have that much skilled labor to work in that kind of environment. We've got skilled labor when it comes to paper mills and trucks and things like that. But how much do we really have to, fill this need if it happens?
Huge challenge, and even I think that is going to be one of the big issues. Look, if this is going to happen, I want it to happen in the best way
Sure.
it's going to happen. And so I think we need to target underemployed sectors. Let's get some people that are chronically unemployed and get them the skills they need. They are putting some money into the technical colleges and the universities for this. My concern is that that is going to come at the expense of other programs. So we'll give you $20 million with one hand for Foxconn, but we're going to cut some of the other programs that might have supported new business development. I think that part is going to be key because Kenosha and Racine are two of the counties that had the highest loss of working age people over the last 5 years. So we're building this in a place where there aren't, as many working age people as there were just 5 years ago. And I think that 43 grand a year might not be enough. And the question is, will a company as cutthroat as Foxconn be willing to pay 60 grand a year to make sure they get people? They're not just factory jobs. There are going to be some high-end jobs that are a part of this. But I think it's a myth to assume that there's going to be this supply chain. They have the identical plant in China now, and all the supply chain for these screens is going to stay in China. The assembly is going to happen in Wisconsin, the development of the screens, but I'd be really surprised if you have the pie in the sky residual development that you're hearing some of these people say.
All right, well, let's shift gears. We've got about maybe 12 minutes left. I want to talk about two other things, and they're small on the scale when you compare it to everything we've talked about here, but to the folks where they're affected by this, it's a huge thing. One was something that Walker slipped into the biennium budget. It's really not gotten any media attention other than, I think I've talked about it on this show. Insurance benefits for domestic partners were cut. Domestic partners of state workers were cut by way of what he put into this last budget. And I want to know did that affect just state workers or did it affect county workers as well?
I believe it impacted all public employees, and I probably would have been able to rattle all of this off during the budget. My capacity's not there.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened was we had the marriage amendment in 2006 that banned, same-sex marriage. In 2009, we passed the domestic partner benefits bill. Obviously, the court ruled, recognized same-sex marriage. The governor said, well, there's no need for domestic partner benefits, even though, we had thousands of people who had been in these partnerships. Their benefits were dependent on it. It provided them a set of rights.
Sure. And everyone hasn't gotten married for the same reason that a lot of heterosexual people live together without benefit of marriage. Maybe you just don't want to get married for whatever reason.
And because we have tied our benefit system in this country largely to those institutions of marriage or whatever, we should be more concerned about making sure that we're preserving viable options for people to access those benefits in whatever relationship they're in. And so we had this debate about it, and in the case of the domestic partner relationships, it's not just, it's heterosexual couples as well. Sometimes it's an older couple who maybe they're both divorced and they didn't want to get remarried. Each case is going to be different, but I think the change was unnecessary. It's probably done for ideological reasons.
Is it really going to save a whole lot of money? No, I doubt it seriously. It was just kind of a way to, I think, stick it to some people. And I'm glad that you made the point that it's not just about homosexual couples. It could affect anyone, really, who doesn't want to get married but has a very bona fide, very committed relationship with someone. So the other thing that I wanted to bring up was, this is Assembly Bill 666, and I don't even like those numbers, but this has to do with, I'm sure folks in this, who view this show on local cable access are very familiar with this case because it's made the news quite a bit, where a local person in northeast Wisconsin was sexually assaulting horses. Not his horses, necessarily. He went around and he was sexually assaulting other people's horses. So there are measures that some lawmakers have tried to put into place to make this more of a crime than our state currently views it as. And there was testimony last week, as we are taping this, the last week in January, there was testimony down in Madison. And one of the things that we need is there needs to be a Senate companion bill to go along with this. So where is it at? I'm assuming that you're supportive of Assembly Bill 666.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly saw the headlines. I haven't dove into the details of the bill. Oftentimes what happens, thankfully this is not something that happens very often, but when something like this does happen, and I think most people are highly offended, it gets through the courts, and then we're disappointed that the consequences don't fit the severity of the crime, and then these issues get brought up where the judges say, well, we don't have anything that really acknowledges this, and so in this case, there was a bill introduced to try to answer this. Should this happen, again, you want to have something on the books. Of course, a lot of people probably don't want to spend their time advocating for talking about horse sex, but so I don't know if that's the reason that there's not a bill in the Senate, but again, it came out of a real situation. You certainly don't want it to happen again, and you want there to be consequences that are proportionate to the crime.
Right, and this really wouldn't require a whole lot of time on someone's part to sponsor this and get it moved, because there was not any testimony last week that was in opposition to this.
No.
None whatsoever. I mean, it seems like it's a no-brainer, really.
Yeah.
And this particular gentleman it wasn't just a one-time thing. He's been convicted of this time and time and time again, and yet the way the state law is written, there's nothing really that can be done to touch him. And obviously he needs some mental health counseling as well. And that brings up another whole aspect of things that we don't even have time for in the remaining 90 seconds that we have. So what do folks need to do? What do I need to do as someone who's concerned about this? Do I need to contact someone in the Senate to see if they would sponsor it?
Yeah, I would contact your senator on that bill. I mean, the most important thing, we still need to hear from people. I mean, that's the part. We always ask everybody to vote, but we never ask everybody to keep, contacting us on issues that are important to them. And that's something that I think when it becomes a priority for the public, legislators will respond. And so there's still time in the session to get something like that done, and we'll see, where that is in the process, in the final month here.
So you've got 1 month from this date.
We don't have to be done in a month, but it sounds like that's, you want to pick a date because it kind of forces the action. You're going to have a flurry of activity, some things we probably don't like that could use more transparency. It's not a good way to govern by doing a lot of things at the end, but that is sort of the way it is, especially if one house has passed something and the other hasn't. So there's a lot of advocacy going on by a lot of folks.
And when does the session start up again?
I mean, they're talking about being done in the spring and then going to the election.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, very good. Gordon, thanks so much. It's
Thanks
always
for
a
having
pleasure.
me.
I
Absolutely.
think we
Lots
covered
to
a
talk
lot of
about. We
stuff
did.
here.
I'm pretty worn out.
Me as well. All right, thank you. And thanks to the crew. And as always, thanks to you. We appreciate your tuning in or listening to us on the radio. We will see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.